They found the shrine room rebuilt, fresh objects and photographs replacing those that had been removed by the police investigation, evidence that the creature had indeed returned and resumed its activities. And among the new additions, Maya saw a photograph of Ethan Lee, smiling and unaware, taken from what must have been his school directory or family photos, displayed with terrible care alongside toys and items that had belonged to him, proof that he had already been claimed, already added to the collection. But the photograph being here meant Ethan might still be alive somewhere deeper in the tunnels, because the creature liked to play with its victims, liked to savor their fear before consuming them, a fact Maya remembered from her research into the historical cases and from the psychological profile she had built over years of studying similar entities. She pressed forward with renewed urgency, leading her team through passages that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering flashlight beams, through sections where the graffiti grew more intense and disturbing, where the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with their own light, where the air grew thick and hard to breathe as if the tunnel itself was alive and resisting their intrusion. They could hear it now, the carnival music echoing from multiple directions, and underneath that music, laughter that sounded like glass breaking and children screaming, and Maya knew they were getting close to the creature's central lair, to the place where it took its victims for the final games before feeding. The tunnel opened into a massive chamber that had not existed on any map Maya had ever seen, a natural cavern that the sewer system had accidentally connected to, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness far overhead and walls that glistened with moisture and something else, something organic and wrong, like the inside of a living throat. In the center of this chamber stood the creature, but it was not alone, because surrounding it were other figures, pale and twisted, wearing fragments of old clothing and bearing faces that might once have been human, but had been transformed into something else, something that served the Crimson Smile thing that ruled this underground domain. These were the children it had taken, Maya realized with horror, not killed and consumed but changed, corrupted, turned into servants or spawn or extensions of the creature itself, still existing in some terrible state between life and death, between human and monster. And among them, she saw faces she recognized from the photographs in the shrine, including Tommy Henderson, who should have been a man in his 30s by now, but instead remained forever 9 years old, his features distorted and his eyes holding the same red glow as his master. And there, suspended in some kind of web or cocoon made from material Maya preferred not to identify, was Ethan Lee, alive but unconscious, wrapped up and waiting to be transformed or consumed. And Maya knew that if they did not act immediately, the boy would be lost forever, would join the ranks of the creature's servants, and spend eternity in this dark chamber serving a master that had stolen his humanity and his future. The creature saw them, and smiled its terrible crimson smile, spreading its arms in a gesture of welcome or mockery, and when it spoke its voice was the same chorus of children's voices Maya remembered but amplified now by its servants, who spoke in unison with their master, creating a sound that reverberated through the chamber and made her bones ache with its wrongness. "You returned," it said, and there was satisfaction in that terrible voice, anticipation, hunger sharpened by recognition and memory. The girl who heard me, who trapped me, who thought she had won, you returned and brought friends to feed me, to give me strength. How thoughtful, how kind, how foolish to think you could challenge me in my own domain where I am strongest, where I have had 27 years to grow and prepare and plan my revenge. Maya raised her voice above the chorus, shouting to be heard, telling the creature that it was wrong, that they had come prepared, that they knew its nature and its weaknesses, and that this time they would destroy it permanently rather than just trapping it. Though even as she spoke the brave words, she felt doubt gnawing at her because she had no weapon like the one she had used before, no silver blade engraved with ancient symbols, nothing but conventional weapons, and the courage of people who had chosen to face evil despite knowing they might not survive the encounter. The creature laughed and gestured, and its servants moved forward, those corrupted children advancing with jerky, unnatural movements, their hands ending in claws, and their mouths revealing too many teeth. And Maya's team met them with whatever weapons they carried, striking out with iron and silver and blessed implements, fighting desperately against enemies that had once been victims themselves, that deserved pity rather than violence, but that were too far gone to save, too completely corrupted by the creature's influence to be restored to humanity. The battle was chaotic and terrifying, fought in near darkness broken only by flashlight beams that seemed inadequate against the supernatural shadows, and Maya fought her way through the servant children toward the creature itself, knowing that killing or dispersing the spawn would accomplish nothing if the master remained, that she needed to reach Ethan and get him out or confront the creature directly even without a proper weapon. She was tackled by 3 of the servant children at once, their small bodies possessed of terrible strength, and she went down hard, her flashlight skittering away across the chamber floor, and she could feel their claws tearing at her clothes and skin, could see their distorted faces inches from her own, could smell the decay that emanated from their body. Yes, and she was certain she was about to die, about to join them in their undead servitude, when someone pulled them off her, a member of her team sacrificing himself to give her a chance to continue forward. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward Ethan's cocoon, pulling a knife from her belt and slashing at the webbing that held him suspended, and the material was tougher than she expected, resisting the blade, stretching rather than cutting, but she kept sawing desperately while behind her the sounds of battle continued, people screaming, and the servant children shrieking, and the creature laughing its terrible laugh. She finally cut through enough webbing that Ethan fell free, landing in her arms unconscious but breathing, his skin cold but his heart still beating, and Maya cradled him for just a moment before the creature was there, moving with that impossible speed she remembered, knocking her aside and taking the boy back, lifting him high with one clawed hand while the other reached for Maya's throat. She rolled away, avoiding the grab by inches, came up with her knife held defensively knowing it was useless against this thing, but having nothing else, and she saw in the creature's red eyes something that might have been respect or might have been amusement, recognition that she had courage even if that courage would not be enough to save her. But then she saw something else, saw behind the creature a figure emerging from one of the side tunnels, a figure dressed in the tattered uniform of a police officer from decades past, and Maya recognized him from photographs in Okonkwo's files, recognized Officer James Patterson, who had been part of the 1996 investigation team and who had supposedly killed himself shortly after, but who now moved with purpose and determination toward the creature's back, carrying in his hands the silver weapon that Maya had used all those years ago, the blade that had trapped the creature once, and that might be able to do so again. Except Patterson was dead, had been dead for 27 years, and the figure carrying the weapon moved with the same jerky, unnatural gait as the servant children, and Maya realized with horror that this was another of the creature's pawns, that Patterson had not killed himself, but had been taken and transformed, and the weapon was not being brought to help her, but was being delivered to the creature as a prize, recovered from wherever it had been hidden so the creature could destroy it or claim it or neutralize it as a threat. The creature turned at Patterson's approach, seemed surprised for just a moment, and in that moment of distraction Maya acted on pure instinct, launching herself forward not at the creature but at Patterson, tackling the corrupted officer and grasping for the weapon, struggling against strength that was far greater than any human should possess, but fighting with desperation and determination born from knowing that this was the last chance. That if the creature go the weapon, it would be over. All of them would die, or worse, would join the ranks of undead servants in this nightmare chamber. Her fingers closed around the hilt, and she felt that same surge of power she remembered from before, felt the weapon recognize her as its wielder, felt it respond to her need and intention, and she pulled it free from Patterson's grasp and spun toward the creature, which was now advancing on her with murder in its red eyes, and that crimson smile stretched impossibly wide. She did not wait for it to reach her, but charged forward to meet it, the weapon held high, channeling into the blade every ounce of rage and fear and determination she possessed, thinking of Marcus and Ethan and all the children who had been taken over the decades, thinking of Detective Okonkwo and her team fighting the servant children behind her, thinking of every person who had suffered because of this thing's hunger and evil. And she drove the blade deep into the creature's chest, felt it pierce through whatever passed for its heart, felt the weapon activate and begin its work of absorption and entrapment. The creature shrieked and thrashed, trying to pull away from the blade but finding itself held fast, finding that the more it struggled the deeper the weapon drew it in, and the servant children throughout the chamber stopped their attacks and turned toward their master, sensing his distress, beginning to move toward Maya to save him, but finding themselves unable to approach, held back by the same force that was drawing the creature into the weapon. The absorption process took longer this time, perhaps because the creature was stronger after 27 years of recovery, perhaps because it had learned from the first entrapment and was resisting more effectively, but eventually the outcome was the same, the creature's substance breaking apart into those streamers of light and shadow, its white face distorting and melting, its crimson smile finally fading as it was pulled inexorably into the blade, which pulsed with increasing intensity, glowing red, and then white, and then red again, as it consumed the ancient evil that had terrorized Millbrook Falls for over a century. When it was finally over, when the last traces of the creature had been absorbed, the servant children throughout the chamber collapsed as if their strings had been cut, falling to the ground and lying still, and in the sudden silence Maya could hear her own ragged breathing and the groans of her team members who had survived the battle, and she looked down at the weapon in her hands, which now felt heavier than before, weighted with the souls or essences of not one, but two instances of the creature trapped within the silver metal and hopefully contained permanently this time. She went to Ethan immediately, checking his vitals and finding him still alive, still breathing, apparently unharmed physically, though what psychological trauma he might have suffered remained to be seen. And she wrapped him in her jacket and picked him up, carrying him toward the exit, while other team members helped the wounded and checked the fallen servant children, who were now just corpses, bodies that had been preserved in their corrupted state, but that collapsed into rapid decay once the animating force was withdrawn. Faces becoming recognizable briefly as the human children they had once been before decomposition claimed them and returned them to dust. The journey back to the surface felt endless, Maya's arms burning with the effort of carrying Ethan, her body screaming with pain from injuries sustained in the fight. But she forced herself to keep moving, to climb when climbing was necessary, to crawl when the tunnels were too low for walking, refusing to stop until she emerged into daylight and fresh air and the waiting arms of police and paramedics, who took Ethan from her and wrapped her in blankets and tried to check her injuries while she insisted she was fine, that others had been hurt worse, that they needed to go back down for the casualties and the evidence. Ethan recovered in the hospital over the following days, having no memory of his time in the tunnels except vague nightmare impressions, a mercy that Maya was grateful for, even as part of her wished he could remember and testify to what had happened, could provide evidence that would force the authorities to acknowledge the truth. But as before, the official story became something more palatable, reports of a disturbed individual living in the sewers who had abducted the boy and created the shrine, a person who had fled or died in the tunnel system before capture, leaving behind evidence of mental illness and obsession, but nothing supernatural, nothing that challenged the comfortable boundaries of accepted reality. Maya knew better than to argue this time, understood that some truths would never be officially acknowledged, that the weapon she carried and the knowledge she possessed would remain secret because revealing them would create more problems than it solved, because the world was not ready to accept that monsters were real, and that brave people fought them in darkness and obscurity without recognition or reward. She returned to her practice and her life, carrying new scars, both physical and psychological, having lost friends in the battle, but having saved Ethan and ended the creature's threat permanently, or as permanently as such things could ever be ended. And she resumed her work helping people deal with trauma and unexplained phenomena, drawing on her expanded experience to provide better guidance and support. The weapon presented the same problem as before: how to secure it when it now contained even more dangerous material, and Maya spent considerable time researching and consulting with experts in her network before finally determining that the only truly safe option was to carry it with her always, to make herself the guardian and keeper of the blade, accepting the burden and the risk that came with that responsibility, because she trusted no institution or system to maintain security indefinitely, had learned through painful experience that even the best precautions could fail through accident or bad luck or cosmic malevolence. She had a special sheath made for the weapon, blessed and warded according to multiple traditions, and she wore it concealed beneath her clothing, a constant weight and reminder of what she had done and what she had sworn to protect the world from. And over the years it became part of her, so familiar that she felt incomplete without it, so integrated into her identity that she could not imagine being separated from it. Marcus, now in his 30s with children of his own, finally learned the truth about what had happened that night when he was 7, Maya deciding that he deserved to know why his life had taken the turn it had, why his sister had become the person she was, and his reaction was complex, denial giving way to acceptance as she showed him evidence and scars, and finally the weapon itself, letting him hold it briefly so he could feel the power and wrongness contained within the silver blade. He thanked her for saving him, for dedicating her life to protecting others, and he promised to teach his own children to be aware and careful, to trust their instincts about danger, to know that the world contained wonders and terrors beyond what most people acknowledged. And Maya felt a sense of completion at this, knowing that the knowledge would be passed to a new generation, that her nephew and niece would grow up with advantages she had never had, prepared rather than ignorant, alert rather than complacent. The years continued their march, Maya growing older but not retiring, unable to imagine giving up the work that had defined her adult life, that had given meaning to her trauma and purpose to her survival, and she trained others when she could, passing on her knowledge and skills to those who showed the capacity and courage to face what most people never saw. She wrote more books, some fiction and some disguised as academic research, building a library of practical information about supernatural threats and how to combat them, and she hoped that long after she was gone her words would continue to help people, would provide guidance to future monster hunters who would face their own darkness and need to know they were not alone, that others had fought these battles before and had found ways to win. She thought often about Detective Okonkwo, about the legacy they had built together, about the chain of knowledge and courage that stretched back through time, connecting all those who had chosen to stand against evil rather than pretend it did not exist. And she found comfort in being part of that tradition, in knowing that her life had mattered, that the frightened teenager who had once peered into a storm drain and seen a monster had grown into a woman who fought monsters and won him. Or often than she lost, who saved lives and prevented suffering and made the world incrementally safer, even if the world never knew her name or understood her sacrifice. On the 27th anniversary of her second encounter with the creature, Maya returned to Millbrook Falls and stood on the cliff overlooking the town where she had grown up, where she had first learned that monsters were real and that ordinary people could become heroes if they chose courage over fear. And she touched the weapon at her side and felt its weight and its power and its contained evil. And she made a promise to herself and to all the victims past and future that she would never stop fighting, that she would carry this burden until her last breath, that as long as she lived no child would be taken by the darkness if she had any power to prevent it. The sun set over Millbrook Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Maya watched the light fade and the darkness rise. And she was not afraid because she had faced the darkness before and knew its nature, knew that it could be fought and beaten, knew that light always returned after the longest night. knew that good people making brave choices could hold back evil even when the odds seemed impossible. And she carried that knowledge like a flame in her heart, warming her against the cold of a world that contained more monsters than most people would ever imagine, a world that needed guardians and hunters, and people willing to descend into sewers and tunnels and dark places to drag children back from the edge of nightmare. And she had become that person, had earned that role through trial and blood and triumph. And she would not fail, would never surrender, would fight until her final breath to protect the innocent and destroy the evil that lurked in shadows and sewers and the forgotten spaces beneath the streets where crimson smiles waited in the darkness to feed on young terror and young flesh, but where now they would find instead a woman with silver in her hair and a weapon in her hand, and the absolute determination to end them before they could claim another victim, before they could add another photograph to their shrines or another small skeleton to their collections. And in this eternal struggle between light and darkness, between the birthday balloon floated through the storm drain with a soft squeak, its red surface gleaming under the single streetlight, and 7-year-old Marcus Chin reached for it without thinking, his small fingers stretching into the darkness, where something that was definitely not a balloon waited with a smile full of teeth that had never been designed for smiling. The thing in the drain grabbed his wrist with fingers that felt like ice wrapped in wet leather, and Marcus screamed as he was yanked forward, his knees scraping against the concrete. But before he disappeared into that black mouth beneath the street, his older sister Maya tackled him from behind, wrapping her arms around his waist and pulling with strength born from pure terror. The thing in the drain laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a child's giggle played backwards, and for just one horrible second, Maya saw its face, white as bone and stretched too wide, with eyes that were the color of old blood and a smile painted in crimson that seemed to go all the way around its head. Then it let go, and Maya and Marcus tumbled backward onto the wet pavement as thunder cracked overhead and the rain came down harder, washing away the red balloon that had started it all, though Maya knew with cold certainty that what she had seen was no costume, no mask, no trick of the light, but something ancient and hungry that lived in the spaces beneath their small town of Millbrook Falls. That night, while Marcus slept fitfully in the bed next to hers, Maya lay awake listening to the rain hammer against their bedroom window and trying to convince herself that what she had seen was impossible, that fear and darkness and her overactive imagination had created a monster where there was probably just a homeless person or maybe even a large dog. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face, that impossibly white face with its crimson smile, and she knew that something evil had taken up residence in their town, something that had been waiting in the dark places for children to come close enough to grab. The next morning, Maya woke to find that Marcus had no memory of the previous night's events, which should have been a relief, but instead filled her with a different kind of dread, as if whatever had been in that drain had reached into her brother's mind and erased itself, leaving only a blank space where terror should have been. She tried to tell her parents what had happened, but the words came out wrong, sounding like the paranoid fantasies of a teenager who watched too many horror movies, and her father just patted her shoulder and told her that imagination was a wonderful thing, but that she needed to learn to distinguish between reality and fiction. Her mother was more sympathetic, but equally dismissive, suggesting that Maya had been overtired and that the stress of starting high school next month was making her anxious, manifesting in vivid dreams and waking hallucinations. Maya wanted to scream at them that this was not a dream, not a hallucination, that something with a crimson smile had tried to drag Marcus into the storm drain, but she could see in their eyes that they would never believe her, that adults had lost the ability to see what children still recognized instinctively as real danger. So Maya kept quiet and began her own investigation, spending the following days in the town library poring over old newspapers and local history books, searching for any mention of missing children or unexplained disappearances or urban legends about things that lived in sewers. What she found was more disturbing than she had anticipated, a pattern of disappearances stretching back nearly a century, children who had vanished without a trace every 27 years like clockwork, their cases going cold because there were never any bodies, never any evidence, just empty bedrooms and grieving parents and a town that seemed eager to forget and move on. The most recent cycle had been 27 years ago in 1996, when 6 children had disappeared over the course of one terrible summer, their faces still haunting the missing persons board at the police station, even though everyone knew they were never coming home. Before that, in 1969, 5 children had vanished during a particularly harsh winter, their last known locations scattered across town, but all within walking distance of storm drains or sewer grates or other openings that led down into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath Millbrook Falls. Going back further, Maya found references to disappearances in 1942, in 1915, and even in 1888, when the town was still young and the sewer system was first being constructed, each cycle claiming between 4 and 7 young victims, each cycle ending as mysteriously as it had begun, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak and a collective amnesia that seemed to descend on the town like a fog, making people forget or stop asking or convince themselves that lightning had simply struck the same place multiple times through pure coincidence. Maya created a timeline in her notebook, marking each disappearance with careful notes about the victim's age, location, and circumstances, and as the pattern became clearer, so did the horrifying realization that the current cycle had already begun, that Marcus had nearly become the first victim of what would likely be another summer of horror, and that unless someone did something, more children would disappear into those dark tunnels to feed whatever waited below. She tried to take her research to the police, showing up at the station with her notebook and her photocopied newspaper articles, but the desk sergeant looked at her with tired eyes and told her that the department appreciated concerned citizens, but that she should leave the detective work to the professionals. When Maya insisted that there was a pattern, that something evil was active in their town right now, the sergeant's expression shifted from tired to concerned, and he asked if everything was all right at home, if she was feeling stressed or scared, if maybe she needed to talk to someone about these fears she was experiencing. Maya recognized the look in his eyes, the same look her parents had given her, the look that said this child is troubled and needs help, but not the kind of help she thinks she needs. And she left the station feeling more alone and frightened than ever, understanding that she would receive no assistance from the authorities, that whatever action needed to be taken would have to come from her alone. But Maya was only 14 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and 100 pounds so. Aching wet, with no experience fighting monsters, and no idea how to stop something that had been hunting children for over a century, something that could apparently make people forget it existed, something that lived in the darkness beneath the streets and emerged every 27 years to feed on young terror and young flesh. She spent the next week in a state of hypervigilance, walking Marcus to and from his summer camp, scanning every storm drain and sewer grate they passed, jumping at shadows and strange sounds, exhausting herself with worry and lack of sleep until her mother insisted she see their family doctor, who prescribed mild anti-anxiety medication and suggested that Maya might benefit from talking to a therapist about her obsessive thoughts and paranoid ideation. The medication made Maya feel fuzzy and distant, as if she was viewing the world through a thick pane of glass, and she stopped taking it after 2 days, flushing the pills down the toilet and lying to her mother about swallowing them, knowing that she needed to stay sharp and alert because something was hunting in Millbrook Falls, and she was the only person who seemed to recognize the danger. It was during this time that Maya began to notice the balloons, red balloons appearing in odd places around town, tied to mailboxes and stop signs and park benches, floating in gutters and bobbing against storm drains, always red and always in locations where children frequently passed. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that her stressed mind was creating patterns where none existed, but then she started taking photographs with her phone, documenting each balloon she found, and the evidence became undeniable. Someone or something was marking locations with red balloons, creating a map of hunting grounds, advertising its presence to those few individuals who still had eyes to see. Maya followed the balloons like a trail of breadcrumbs, mapping their locations in her notebook alongside the historical disappearance sites, and discovered that they clustered around 3 main areas: the old neighborhood near the original town center where the sewer system was oldest, the elementary school where Marcus and hundreds of other children spent their days, and Riverside Park with its elaborate drainage system and multiple access points to the tunnels below. Each of these locations had been the site of previous disappearances. Children who had been playing or walking or simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time when the thing with the crimson smile had reached up from below to claim them. Armed with this knowledge, but still without any real plan, Maya decided that she needed to go down into the tunnels herself, to see what lurked in those dark spaces, to gather evidence that even skeptical adults would have to acknowledge as real. She recruited 2 of her classmates, Danny Rodriguez and Keisha Washington, both of whom had younger siblings and both of whom were willing to belie that something strange was happening in their town, even if they could not quite accept Maya's more supernatural explanation. Together they planned their expedition with the seriousness of soldiers preparing for battle, gathering flashlights and rope and a video camera borrowed from Danny's older brother, downloading maps of the sewer system from the Public Works Department website, and choosing their entry point carefully based on Maya's research into previous disappearance locations. They went down on a Saturday afternoon when Maya's parents thought she was at the movies, prying open a storm drain cover in an alley behind the shuttered downtown movie theater, an alley that had been the last known location of two of the 1996 victims, sisters aged 8 and 6, who had been walking home from a matinee showing of some Disney film when they simply vanished between one block and the next. The tunnel beneath the grate was larger than Maya had expected, a concrete pipe big enough for an adult to walk through while stooping, with rusty metal rungs leading down into darkness that their flashlights could barely penetrate. The smell that rose up was overwhelming, a mixture of sewage and stagnant water and something else, something sweet and rotten that made Maya's stomach turn. But she forced herself to climb down anyway, with Danny following close behind and Keisha bringing up the rear, her hand shaking so badly that her flashlight beam danced crazily across the tunnel walls. They found graffiti almost immediately, strange symbols spray-painted on the concrete that looked like no language Maya had ever seen, angular and long, making her eyes hurt when she tried to focus on them too long. And beneath the symbols, children's drawings in chalk and crayon, stick figures holding red balloons, stick figures with too many teeth, stick figures being pulled into circular mouths that could only be drains. Keisha wanted to turn back right then, her voice high and frightened as she pointed out that someone clearly used these tunnels, that they were trespassing and possibly putting themselves in danger from gang activity or drug dealers or some other rational threat. But Maya pushed forward, following the main tunnel as it branched and twisted, marking their path with chalk so they could find their way back, her heart pounding but her determination unwavering because she knew that answers waited. Somewhere in this darkness, answers about what had tried to take Marcus, and what had taken so many others before him. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the tunnel sometimes narrowing so they had to crawl on hands and knees through spaces slick with moisture and things Maya preferred not to identify, sometimes opening into larger chambers where multiple pipes converged and water dripped from overhead, creating echoes that sounded almost like whispers or laughter. In one of these chambers, they found the first shrine, and shrine was tea. The only word Maya could think to describe it, a collection of objects arranged with clear intentionality on a dry ledge above the water line. Children's toys from different eras, a wooden top, a Rubik's Cube, a Tamagotchi, a fidget spinner, each toy aged and worn but placed with care, and among the toys, photographs, dozens of photographs of children, black and white and color and Polaroid and digital prints. The faces of missing children staring out from their frames with smiles that would never age, never change, frozen forever at the moment before they were taken. Danny trained his video camera on the shrine, capturing evidence while Keisha and Maya stood in horrified silence, and then they heard it, echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnels. A sound like carnival music played through a broken music box, discordant and wrong, growing louder as something moved through the darkness toward them. They ran, flashlights bouncing wildly, the chalk marks they had made almost impossible to follow in their panic, splashing through water that seemed to grab at their ankles with fingers that felt too real to be mere current, the carnival music following them, always just behind, punctuated now by that same terrible laughter Maya had heard the night at the storm drain. They burst out of the tunnel into gray afternoon light like drowning victims breaking the surface, gasping and filthy and traumatized, yanking the great clothes behind them, and not stopping their run until they reached Danny's house 3 blocks away, where they collapsed on his front lawn trying to catch their breath and process what they had experienced. The video Danny had recorded was corrupted, showing only static and occasional frames of darkness. No shrine, no photographs, no evidence of anything except 3 teenagers crawling through sewers, which his older brother found hilarious when Danny tried to explain what they had been doing. But Maya had taken one of the photographs from the shrine, slipping it into her pocket in the moment before they heard the music, and now she pulled it out with trembling hands, looking at the faded Polaroid image of a young boy with an earnest smile and 1990s haircut, the date stamped in the corner reading July 15, 1996, and on the back, written in a child's careful handwriting, Tommy Henderson, age 9, along with an address Maya recognized as being just 4 streets over from her own house. She looked up Tommy Henderson that night on her computer, finding his missing person case in the online archives, seeing that he had indeed disappeared on July 15, 1996, last seen leaving the public pool in the early evening, his body never recovered, the case never solved, his parents having moved away years ago, unable to bear living in the town where their son had vanished. The photograph in Maya's possession should not exist, should be evidence held by police or treasured by grieving parents, should be anywhere except in a shrine in the sewers next to Toys From Other missing children, yet here it was, tangible proof that something malevolent lived below the streets and collected trophies from its victims. Armed with this evidence, Maya returned to the police station, this time asking specifically for Detective Sarah Okonkwo, whom Maya had read about in the newspaper archives as being the lead investigator on the 1996 cases before the trail went cold. Detective Okonkwo was an imposing woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. And when Maya presented the photograph and explained where she had found it, the detective's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Maya to identify before settling on something that looked like resignation mixed with old pain. Okonkwo asked Maya to wait, disappeared into a back office, and returned 20 minutes later with a file folder and a cup of coffee that she set in front of Maya despite the girl being too young for caffeine, as if they were colleagues about to discuss a difficult case rather than cop and child. What Detective Okonkwo told Maya in the quiet interview room over the next hour would have sounded insane coming from anyone else, but the detective spoke with the flat certainty of someone who had long ago accepted an impossible truth, explaining that she had been a rookie officer during the 1996 disappearances, that she had been one of the few who pursued the cases with real determination, that she had gone down into the tunnels with a team of officers and found evidence of something living there, something that should not and could not exist according to any rational understanding of the world. They had seen it, Okonkwo said, seen the thing with the white face and the crimson smile, seen it moving through the darkness with impossible speed and flexibility, seen it vanish into spaces too small for any human to fit through, and in the moment of that seeing, she and her fellow officers had experienced something that broke their understanding of reality. A terror so profound and otherworldly that 3 of the men had quit the force within a month, and the 4th had drunk himself to death. By the following year, Okonkwo herself had tried to report what they had found, had tried to organize a more extensive search of the tunnel system, had pushed for specialized help from state or federal authorities. But her superiors had shut her down hard, making it clear that such talk would end her career, that the official position was that a transient or possibly multiple transients were responsible for the disappearances, that creating public panic about sewer monsters would be irresponsible and career-ending, and that Detective Okonkwo needed to accept that some cases simply could not be solved. She had accepted this for 27 years, Okonkwo admitted, pushing the memories down, convincing herself that she had been mistaken or temporarily insane, that fear and darkness had created something in her mind that was not real. But now Maya was sitting in front of her with a photograph that should not exist, and eyes that held the same haunted certainty that Okonkwo remembered seeing in her own mirror back in 1996. And the detective knew that the cycle had begun again, that the thing in the tunnels was hunting once more, and that this time she could not look away or pretend or convince herself that evil lived only in the human heart and not in ancient things that lurked beneath the streets. Together they formed an unlikely alliance, a teenage girl and a disillusioned detective, united by their knowledge of something that most people would never see and never believe, and they began to plan not just how to stop the current cycle of disappearances but how to end the pattern permanently, to destroy whatever had been feeding on the children of Millbrook Falls for over a century. Okonkwo shared her files from 1996, official and unofficial, including notes she had kept in a personal journal about the investigation and what she had seen, sketches of the tunnel layouts and the shrine they had found and the creature itself, drawn with shaking hands in the days after the encounter, its white face and crimson smile rendered in pencil, but still disturbing in their accuracy to what Maya had glimpsed that night at the storm drain. The detective also shared her theories, developed over years of quiet research done in her spare time, about what the creature might be, where it might have come from, and most importantly, what it wanted and needed. Okonkwo believed, based on the 27-year cycle, that the creature required some kind of hibernation or dormant period, that it fed intensively during its active phase, and then retreated into a deeper state of rest, possibly in some central location within the tunnel system, where it was vulnerable, but also protected by the labyrinthine nature of the sewers, and by its own ability to make people forget or dismiss its existence. If they could find this central location during the active phase and attack the creature there with the right weapons or methods, they might be able to kill it permanently, to end the cycle before more children disappeared. But finding the creature's lair would require going deep into the tunnel system, deeper than Maya and her friends had ventured, deeper perhaps than Okonkwo and her team had reached in 1996, into spaces that were not on any official map, into darkness that had existed before the town was built, because Okonkwo suspected that the creature was far older than the sewer system, that it had been living in natural caves and underground waterways long before humans arrived, that the town's founders had unwittingly built their drainage system to connect with the creature's existing habitat, giving it easy access to the surface and to the children who played above. Maya asked the obvious question: if the creature was so old and powerful, if it had been hunting successfully for over a century, what made Oko Nkwo think that two people, one teenage girl and one middle-aged cop, could succeed where presumably others had failed, where entire police teams armed with guns and numbers had retreated in terror? The detective smiled grimly and pulled out one more file, this one labeled with a name Maya recognized from her research: Edmund Torrance, the town's founder, who had overseen the construction of the sewer system in 1888 and who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances shortly after its completion, his body never found. His final journal entries, speaking of a terrible mistake and a price that would be paid in innocent blood for generations to come. Torrance had known, Okonkwo explained, had somehow discovered or been told by the creature itself that his construction project had disturbed something ancient, had given it easier hunting grounds in exchange for allowing the town to be built, a bargain sealed in ways that Torrance had recorded in coded language, but that Okonkwo had spent years deciphering. The founder had tried to undo what he had done, had entered the tunnels with a weapon he believed would work against the creature, a weapon he had commissioned from a blacksmith using old designs from European folklore about killing supernatural entities. But he had never returned from that final expedition, and the weapon had never been found. Okonkwo believed that weapon still existed somewhere in the tunnels, that finding it was the key to stopping the creature permanently, that Torrance had gotten close to the lair before being killed, and that if they could retrace his steps and locate the weapon, they would have a fighting chance. It sounded like a desperate plan because it was a desperate plan, but Maya had no better alternative, and she could see in Okonkwo's eyes the same desperate need for redemption that drove her own actions, the need to save children who still had futures ahead of them, to prevent the kind of grief and loss that haunted the families of past victims. They spent the next week preparing for their descent, gathering equipment that seemed laughably inadequate for fighting a monster, but was the best they could manage: heavy flashlights and backup batteries, rope and climbing gear, first aid supplies, and for weapons, a police-issue handgun that Okonkwo carried in violation of about a dozen department regulations, and a baseball bat that Maya had reinforced with nails, because she had seen enough horror movies to know that sometimes crude weapons were more effective than sophisticated ones. They also studied the maps obsessively, comparing the official layouts with Torrance's journal entries and Okonkwo's notes from 1996, trying to triangulate where the deepest point might be, where the natural cave system would intersect with the constructed tunnels, where a creature might establish its lair with maximum security and minimum chance of discovery. Their best guess led them to a section beneath the old downtown district, where the earliest sewers had been built, and where several of the historical disappearances had occurred in close proximity, an area that modern utilities had largely abandoned in favor of more efficient systems, meaning the tunnels there were older, less maintained, and less likely to have human traffic that might disturb a hibernating monster. They chose to go down on a Wednesday afternoon, midweek when Maya's absence from summer activities would be less notable, and when Okonkwo could take a long lunch without raising suspicions, both of them writing goodbye letters that they left in sealed envelopes with instructions to be opened only if they did not return within 12 hours. Letters that explained everything and provided evidence, and pleaded with whoever read them to believe and to act. Their entry point was a maintenance access behind the abandoned textile factory that had once been Millbrook Falls' primary employer. A rusted ladder leading down into darkness that smelled of decay and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made Maya think of overripe fruit and old meat. They descended together, Okonkwo first with her gun drawn and flashlight mounted to the barrel, Maya following with her bat and her backup light, both of them trying to breathe through their mouths to minimize the smell, both of them already fighting the fear that threatened to turn them around and send them running back to the surface where monsters were human-sized and comprehensible. The tunnels here were different from the ones Maya had explored before, older brick construction instead of poured concrete, with arched ceilings that dripped moisture and floors covered in a slick substance that their flashlights revealed to be some kind of organic growth, fungus or mold or something that had no name in conventional biology. The graffiti on these walls was older too, symbols that Okonkwo recognized from her 1996 investigation, marks that might have been warning signs or territorial claims or simply the mad scrawlings of a creature that existed outside human understanding. And among the symbols, more children's drawings. So many drawings stretching back through time, chalk giving way to charcoal, giving way to scratches made with what must have been fingernails or rocks. A historical record of terror maintained by victims over more than a century. They followed the main tunnel for 20 minutes before reaching a junction where 7 different passages converged like the spokes of a wheel, and in the center of this hub, they found another shrine, much larger than the one Maya had discovered before, filling an entire dry platform with objects that represented decades of stolen childhoods. Toys and clothes and school bags and photographs and small skeletons picked clean and arranged with horrible care, tiny bones creating patterns that Maya's mind refused to process, geometric designs that hurt to look at and seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Okonkwo photographed Everett. Hing was shaking hands while Maya fought down the urge to vomit, both of them understanding that they were looking at the remains of children, dozens of children, maybe all the children, who had disappeared over the years. Their bodies never returned to their families. Their bones kept as trophies or decorations or components in some ritual purpose that neither woman wanted to contemplate. And then they heard it, echoing from multiple tunnels simultaneously, so it was impossible to determine the true direction. That same carnival music Maya had heard before, but louder now, and accompanied by sounds that might have been singing or might have been something pretending to sing, words in a language that predated human speech, that resonated in their bones, and made their teeth ache and filled their minds with images of darkness and hunger and endless waiting. The creature was close, Okonkwo whispered, warning Maya to stay alert, to remember that it could move with impossible speed and attack from any direction, and as if summoned by her words, they saw movement in one of the tunnels, a white flash that might have been a face or might have been something else, gone before their flashlights could properly illuminate it, followed by laughter that came from everywhere and nowhere, childlike and ancient, and completely inhuman despite its mimicry of human sounds. They backed against the shrine platform, putting their backs together so they could cover all approaches, light sweeping across the seven-tone mouse, looking for the creature, seeing nothing but knowing it was there, feeling its presence like a weight in the air, like a pressure behind their eyes, like a nightmare taking shape in the waking world. And then it came, not from the tunnels, but from above, dropping from some hidden recess in the ceiling, landing in a crouch that no human spine could achieve, unfolding itself into a shape that was roughly humanoid but wrong in ways that Maya's brain struggled to process. Too tall and too thin, with limbs that bent in too many places, wearing what looked like a clown costume from some bygone era, stained and rotting but somehow still vibrant in its colors of red and white and black, and its face. Oh God, its face! Exactly as Maya remembered from that first glimpse. White as bone, with features that were almost human, but exaggerated and distorted, eyes that were solid red with no whites or pupils, and that smile, that terrible crimson smile that stretched impossibly wide and revealed rows of teeth like broken glass, teeth designed for tearing rather than chewing, teeth that belonged in a shark's mouth, not in anything that walked upright. The creature regarded them with its red eyes, tilting its head like a curious bird, and when it spoke, its voice was a chorus of children's voices layered over each other, dozens of voices speaking in unison, but slightly out of sync, creating an echo effect that made Maya's skin crawl. "Why do you come to my home?" it asked I. And that terrible chorus, "Why do you disturb my rest? Why do you bring weapons when I have done nothing but exist as I have always existed, feeding when I hunger, sleeping when I am sated, living the only life I have ever known in the only way I know how to live?" Okonkwo raised her gun with steady hands and aimed at the creature's chest, but before she could fire, it moved faster than thought, crossing the 15 feet between them in a fraction of a second, knocking the gun away with a casual backhand that sent it skittering into one of the tunnels, and then it hit Okonkwo by the throat, lifting her off the ground with one hand, examining her with those terrible red eyes, while its crimson smile never wavered. "You are not a child," it said in its chorus voice, sounding almost disappointed. "You are old, and your fear is old fear, worn out from too much use, not the fresh terror I need, not the sweet panic that sustains me." And it turned those eyes to Maya, still holding Okonkwo, but focusing its attention on the teenager, who stood frozen with her nail-studded bat raised in a defensive posture that they both knew was utterly inadequate. "But you," it said, and now its voice held interest, held hunger, held the anticipation of a predator that has found exactly the prey it was seeking. "You are young, and your fear is fresh, sharp like new wine, and you came down here knowing what I am, knowing the danger, which makes your terror so much more delicious than the fear of children who do not understand until it is too late. You understand now, and you understand what I am going to do to you and to this old woman who thinks she can stop me with primitive weapons and determination, and that understanding makes you perfect, makes you the feast I have been waiting for all this cycle." Maya wanted to run, but her legs would not obey, wanted to scream, but her voice had abandoned her, could only watch as the creature brought Okonkwo closer to its face, opening its mouth wider than any mouth should open, revealing a throat that seemed to descend into depths impossible to fit inside any physical body, a throat that was more portal than biology, leading to somewhere else, somewhere worse, somewhere that children screamed forever, while being slowly digested by darkness itself. But Okonkwo was not helpless despite being held, had been in this position before during her 1996 investigation, had learned from that encounter, and she pulled from her belt a can of pepper spray that she emptied directly into the creature's face at point-blank range, the caustic chemical seeming to have some effect because it dropped her with a shriek of pain and rage, staggering backward while clawing at its eyes. And in that moment of distraction, Maya found her courage and swung her bat. With all the strength fear and adrenaline could provide, striking the creature's knee with enough force to drive the nails deep into whatever passed for its flesh. The creature shrieked again, a sound the T made the bones in the shrine rattle and caused dust to cascade from the ceiling, and it kicked out reflexively, catching Maya in the chest and sending her flying backward into the shrine platform, where she landed hard enough to knock the air from her lungs, her vision going dark at the edges, fighting to stay conscious while her body insisted on shutting down from pain and shock. Through her dimming vision, she saw Okonkwo scrambling for her fallen gun, saw the creature recovering from the pepper spray faster than should be possible, saw it turn toward the detective with rage in its red eyes and murder in its impossible posture, and Maya knew that in seconds Okonkwo would be dead, that they had failed, that the creature would kill them both and add their bones to the shrine and continue its hunting cycle uninterrupted. And despair flooded through her more completely than any physical injury could cause. But then Maya's hand, scrabbling for purchase on the shrine platform, closed around something metal and cold, something that felt different from the other objects, and she pulled it from beneath a pile of small skulls and found herself holding what could only be Edmund Torrance's lost weapon, a knife or perhaps a short sword, medieval in design, with a blade that even after a century underground still gleamed with silver light, covered in engravings that hurt to look at directly, symbols similar to but more complex than those on the tunnel walls, and the moment her hand gripped the leather-wrapped hilt she felt power flow through her, not her own power, but something older, something placed in this weapon specifically to destroy creatures like the one that now advanced on Okonkwo with murder in its intent. Maya stood on legs that should not have been able to bear her weight, raised the weapon high, and screamed at the creature with a voice that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs, deeper than her fear, a voice that echoed with the rage of every parent who had lost a child, every sibling who had lost a brother or sister, every person whose life had been touched by this thing's endless hunger. And the creature stopped, turned, saw what Maya held, and for the first time showed something that might have been fear in those red eyes, might have been recognition that its reign of terror had finally encountered something it could not simply overwhelm with speed and strength and the ability to make people forget. It came at her anyway because monsters are ultimately driven by hunger more than fear, launching itself across the chamber with claws extended and mouth open wide enough to swallow her head, but Maya met its charge with the weapon held steady, and when the creature impaled itself on the silver blade, when the metal pierced its chest and sank deep into whatever passed for its heart, the shriek it released was not just sound but visible force. A wave of energy that knocked both Maya and Okonkwo to the ground and caused the tunnel walls to crack, brought down chunks of ceiling, and created a rumbling that suggested the entire system might collapse. The creature thrashed on the blade, its white face contorting through expressions no human face could achieve, its crimson smile stretching even wider until it seemed to split its head in half, and then it began to dissolve, not dying in any conventional sense, but unraveling, its substance breaking apart into streamers of light and shadow that spiraled around the weapon, like water circling a drain, being pulled into the engravings on the blade as if the weapon was not just killing the creature, but absorbing it, trapping it within the silver metal where it could do no further harm. The process seemed to take forever and no time at all, reality distorting around the weapon as it consumed the creature, and when it was finally over, when the last traces of white face and crimson smile had been drawn into the blade which now pulsed with a sickly red light, Maya dropped the weapon as if it burned her hands and scrambled backward, her entire body shaking with reaction, while Okonkwo slowly got to her feet and stared at the spot where the creature had been, where now there was nothing except a few pieces of rotting costume and a stain on the floor that might have been blood or might have been something else. They left the tunnels moving faster than was probably safe, not bothering to mark their path or take notes or photograph anything further, just desperate to reach the surface and sunlight and a world where monsters did not exist, even though they both now knew that such a world was an illusion, that monsters were very real and very old, and had been feeding on humanity since before recorded history. They emerged from the maintenance access covered in filth and trembling with exhaustion and trauma, and they sat on the broken pavement behind the abandoned factory for a long time without speaking, each processing what they had experienced, what they had survived, what they had done. Eventually, Okonkwo called for backup using vague language about suspicious activity in the old tunnels, and within an hour the area was swarming with police and fire department personnel who entered the sewer system with lights and cameras and found the shrine with its terrible collection of children's remains, but found no creature, no monster. No explanation for how those bones had gotten there except for the obvious one that some human predator or predators had been using the tunnels for decades, a theory that made far more sense to the investigators than any talk of supernatural entities or creatures from beyond human understanding. The forensics teams worked for 3 days cataloging and removing remains, matching dental records and DNA where possible to missing persons cases stretching back decades, finally giving closure to families who had lived with uncertainty for years, allowing parents to bury their children at last even if the circumstances of their deaths remain net officially mysterious. Okonkwo told the official story carefully, claiming she had received an anonymous tip about the shrine location, omitting any mention of Maya's involvement or the creature they had fought, knowing that introducing such elements would destroy her credibility and possibly end her career, knowing also that some truths were too dangerous or too unbelievable to share with people who had not seen what she had seen. Maya returned home that evening and took the longest shower of her life, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, trying to wash away not just the physical filth of the sewers, but the memory of that terrible white face and crimson smile, the sound of that chorus voice, the feeling of the weapon in her hand as it absorbed the creature into its blade. She could not forget, though, knew she would never forget, that the images would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. But she also knew that she had done something important, something necessary, that because of her actions and Okonkwo's courage, children would be safer in Millbrook Falls, that the cycle of disappearances had finally been broken after more than a century of horror. The weapon itself presented a problem, lying where Maya had dropped it in the tunnel shrine room, pulsing with that sickly red light that suggested the creature it had absorbed was not entirely dead, but merely trapped, and Okonkwo retrieved it before the forensics teams arrived, wrapping it in cloth and taking it to a priest she knew who specialized in unusual spiritual matters. A man who took one look at the blade and immediately understood its nature and its danger. The priest told Okonkwo that the weapon could never be destroyed without releasing what it contained, that it needed to be hidden and protected, placed somewhere secure where no one would accidentally find it, and potentially unleash the creature once more. And together they arranged for the weapon to be sealed in a special container and deposited in a safety deposit box at a bank 3 towns over, a location known only to Okonkwo and the priest, with instructions that if anything happened to either of them, the box was to remain sealed for at least another 27 years, by which time everyone currently alive who knew about the creature would likely be dead, and the knowledge would die with them, which was perhaps for the best. Maya tried to return to normal life, but found it difficult to care about the trivial concerns of teenage existence, when she had seen real evil and fought it and won, when she knew that her classmates were worried about popularity and grades and social media while she carried the weight of having killed a monster and saved an unknown number of future victims. She became withdrawn and quiet, spending more time alone, avoiding her friends Danny and Keisha, who kept asking what had happened during that second tunnel expedition that Maya had undertaken without them, sensing that something significant had occurred, but unable to guess the true nature of events. Her parents noticed the change in her behavior and increased their efforts to get her into therapy, finally succeeding in convincing her to attend sessions with a counselor who specialized in adolescent anxiety and trauma. And Maya went through the motions of therapy without ever telling the truth about what had caused her distress, creating plausible lies about school stress and social pressures, while the real trauma remained locked inside her heart. Marcus continued to have no memory of his near abduction, which Maya considered a blessing, even as part of her wished she could share the burden of knowledge with someone who had been directly affected. But she recognized that his innocence was precious and should be protected, that he deserved to grow up without nightmares about the thing that had tried to drag him into the storm drain. She became fiercely protective of her little brother, walking him everywhere, monitoring his activities with an intensity that he found annoying but that she could not help, driven by the knowledge of what lurked in dark places and what could happen to children who were not careful or who were simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Detective Okonkwo checked in with Maya regularly over the following months, brief phone calls, or coffee meetings where they could talk about the experience they shared without having to explain or justify themselves to skeptical listeners. Two people who knew a truth that the rest of the world would never accept, bonded by trauma and triumph in equal measure. Okonkwo told Maya that the official investigation into the shrine and the recovered remains was ongoing, but that no suspects had been identified and likely never would be, that the case would eventually go cold like all the others had before it, classified as the work of an unknown serial killer or killers who had operated for decades without being caught. A disturbing but ultimately mundane explanation that people could accept and file away without having to confront the possibility of something supernatural and evil living beneath their streets. The red balloons disappeared from around town within a week of the creature's defeat, no new ones appearing to replace those that popped or blew away, as if whatever force had been placing them had been connected to the creature and had ceased to operate once the creature was trapped in the weapon. Maya documented this in her notebook, adding it to her records of the investigation, filling pages with observations and theories and unanswered questions, creating a chronicle of events that she thought maybe someday she would share with someone, perhaps writing a book or article, or simply leaving her notes for future researchers who might encounter similar phenomena, wanting to provide guidance and warning based on her experience. She also continued her research into disappearances in other towns and cities searching for patterns similar to what she had found in Millbrook Falls. And the more she looked, the more she found cycles of missing children in communities across the country and around the world, suggesting that the creature she had fought might not have been unique, that there might be others of its kind living in sewers and tunnels and underground spaces, emerging periodically to feed before returning to hibernation. An entire hidden ecology of predators that humanity had learned to ignore or rationalize or forget about because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. This possibility haunted Maya more than her direct encounter with the creature had, the idea that what she had fought was merely one example of a larger phenomenon, that defeating it had saved the children of one town but left countless others at risk. And she began to wonder if she had a responsibility to do more, to take what she had learned and use it to help other communities, to become some kind of monster hunter or supernatural investigator despite having no credentials or resources or official authority. She shared these thoughts with Okonkwo during one of their coffee meetings, and the detective listened carefully before offering her perspective, pointing out that Maya was still only 14 years old, that she had her entire life ahead of her and should not sacrifice it to chasing monsters, that what they had done together was extraordinary but also extraordinarily dangerous, and had succeeded partly through luck and partly through having the right weapon at the right moment, factors that might not align in future encounters. Okonkwo suggested that Maya focus on living her life, on growing up and going to college and having normal experiences, and that as she still felt called to this kind of work in 10 years, she could consider law enforcement or investigative journalism or some other career that would give her tools and resources to pursue such cases legitimately, but that for now she should allow herself to be a teenager, to heal from the trauma she had experienced, to find joy and connection in the normal world, rather than obsessing about monsters and darkness. Maya knew the detective was right, but found it difficult to follow that advice, finding that once you had seen behind the curtain of normal reality, once you knew that monsters were real, and that most people went through their entire lives blissfully unaware of the dangers that lurked just out of sight, it was almost impossible to pretend ignorance or to care about ordinary concerns. She forced herself to engage with school when it started again in the fall, to participate in activities and maintain friendships and act like a normal teenager. But part of her was always somewhere else, always watching shadows and listening for strange sounds, always ready for the moment when the supernatural would intrude on the mundane once again. Her classmates found her odd and intense in ways they could not quite articulate, and her social circle shrank as people drifted away from her intensity, leaving her with only Danny and Keisha, who remained loyal despite not understanding what had changed their friends so profoundly. Maya tried to explain to them in vague terms, talking about the second tunnel expedition without mentioning the creature or the weapon, describing the shrine and the recovered remains in ways that suggested human evil rather than supernatural horror. And they listened with appropriate shock and sympathy, but she could see in their eyes that they thought she was exaggerating or dramatizing events for effect, that they believed the trauma had distorted her memories into something larger and more significant than reality warranted. This realization that even her closest friends could not fully believe or understand what she had experienced created a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being fundamentally alone despite being surrounded by people, and Maya withdrew further into herself, spending more time reading about folklore and mythology and supernatural phenomena, educating herself about monsters and how different cultures had fought them throughout history, building a knowledge base that she hoped would be useful if she ever encountered another creature like the one she had defeated. The month passed and turned into a year, and then 2 years, and life in Millbrook Falls returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a town that had just discovered the remains of dozens of missing children in its sewer system. The story made national news briefly. True crime podcasters and investigative journalists descending on the town to interview residents and speculate about the unknown killer or killers. But interest faded when no arrests were made and no new information emerged. And eventually the media moved on to fresher horrors, leaving Millbrook Falls to deal with its grief and trauma in private. Memorial services were held for the identified victims, gravestones erected in the town cemetery, a monument commissioned to honor all the children who had been taken, and slowly, painfully, the community began to heal, though the scars would remain forever, a reminder that evil had lived among them for generations and that safety was always an illusion, that the world was more dangerous and more strange than comfortable middle-class existence suggested. Maya attended the memorial services when she could, standing in the back and watching families finally say goodbye to children who had been missing for years or decades, seeing the mixture of relief and renewed grief on parents' faces as they received both closure and confirmation that their worst fears had been realized. And she wondered if she should feel proud of her role in bringing this closure, or guilty that she had not acted sooner, that she had not found the shrine until after her brother's near abduction forced her to investigate. Okonkwo told her during one of their meetings that served. Ivor's guilt was normal and irrational, that Maya had done everything possible, and had in fact done far more than any reasonable person could have expected, that she had saved potentially dozens of future victims by stopping the creature's cycle, and that she should focus on that achievement rather than dwelling on the victims she could not save because they had been taken before she was even born. The advice was sound, but Maya found it difficult to internalize, her dreams still haunted by the small skeletons in the shrine, by the photographs of smiling children who would never grow up, by the terrible knowledge that all those deaths could have been prevented if someone, anyone, had believed in monsters and taken action decades ago. As Maya entered her junior year of high school, she began to think seriously about her future, about what she wanted to do with her life, and how she could channel her experiences into something constructive rather than allowing them to consume her with obsession and guilt. She started volunteering with a missing children's organization, helping to distribute flyers and maintain databases and support families dealing with the nightmare of not knowing what had happened to their kids. Work that felt meaningful and connected to her experience without requiring her to hunt monsters or put herself in danger. She also improved her academic performance, recognizing that if she wanted to make a real difference in the world, she would need education and credentials, and the kind of skills that came from formal training rather than just traumatic experience, and her teachers noticed the change, praising her newfound focus and maturity, attributing it to normal teenage development rather than understanding that she had been forced to grow up faster than anyone should have to. During this time, Maya also began writing about her experience in a fictionalized form, changing names and locations and some details, but keeping the emotional core true, creating a novel about a teenage girl who discovers that monsters are real and has to fight one to save her community. The writing was cathartic, allowing her to process her trauma in a controlled way, to examine her feelings and fears and triumphs from a slight distance that made them more manageable. And as the manuscript grew, she began to think that maybe this was how she could contribute to fighting monsters, not by hunting them directly, but by preparing others, by telling stories that would help people recognize danger when they saw it, by creating fiction that contained essential truths about the darkness that lurked in the world. She shared early chapters with Okonkwo, who read them with interest and some concern, worried that publishing such a book might draw unwanted attention or might be traumatic for Maya to have people analyzing and discussing the worst experience of her life even in fictionalized form, but also recognizing that the story had power, that it might actually help others think about evil and courage, and the responsibility individuals have to act when they see injustice or danger, even when authorities are dismissive or unbelieving. The detective ultimately supported the project but advised Maya to be careful, to change enough details that no one could definitively connect the fiction to reality, to protect both herself and the secret of what had really happened in those tunnels. By her senior year, Maya had completed a full draft of the novel and had started the process of finding a literary agent, sending out queried letters that described the book as a horror thriller about a supernatural predator in a small town and a teenage girl who must stop it, emphasizing the coming-of-age elements, and the themes of courage and responsibility rather than focusing too heavily on the graphic horror aspects. She received numerous rejections, agents telling her that the market was saturated with horror novels, or that the protagonist was too young for the violence described, or that the concept was too similar to certain famous works about evil clowns and missing children. But she persisted, revising and improving and continuing to submit, driven by the belief that her story needed to be told even if the truth had to be disguised as fiction. Meanwhile, life continued in Millbrook Falls, the town slowly recovering its equilibrium, new families moving in who knew nothing of the dark history, children playing in streets and parks without fear because the adults had decided to interpret the shrine discovery as evidence of a human predator who was now either dead or had moved on. A disturbing but ultimately manageable explanation that allowed normal life to resume. Maya watched these children with a mixture of relief and anxiety, glad that they were safe, but unable to fully shake the fear that the creature she had trapped was not truly dead, that the weapon holding it might fail or be discovered and opened by someone who did not understand the danger, that the cycle might somehow resume despite her best efforts to end it permanently. She voiced these concerns to Okonkwo, who admitted to having similar fears, but pointed out that they could only do what was possible within their limitations, that the weapon was as secure as they could make it, that they had no evidence the creature could escape or that there were others of its kind in Millbrook Falls, and that living in constant fear of hypothetical future threats was no way to live at all. The detective encouraged Maya to trust in what they had accomplished, to believe that they had truly ended the cycle, and to focus on building a positive future rather than obsessing about worst-case scenarios that might never materialize. This advice helped somewhat, and Maya began to relax incrementally, allowing herself to enjoy her senior year more than she had enjoyed the previous years of high school, even dating briefly, and attending social events, and thinking about college was something. Approaching excitement rather than just viewing it as the next step in a life that felt predetermined by trauma. She applied to universities with strong psychology and criminal justice programs, thinking that she might become a therapist specializing in trauma or possibly an FBI profiler, careers that would allow her to help people affected by evil without requiring her to directly confront supernatural threats. She was accepted to several schools and ultimately chose a state university about 2 hours from Millbrook Falls, close enough to visit home regularly but far enough to feel like a real departure, a chance to establish an identity separate from being the girl who had fought a monster in the sewers. Before leaving for college, Maya had one final meeting with Detective Okonkwo, who had decided to retire after 30 years on the force, feeling that she had accomplished what she needed to accomplish and that it was time to step back and let younger officers handle the routine cases that made up most police work. They met at their usual coffee shop and talked for hours, reminiscing about the investigation and the battle in the tunnels, discussing what they had each learned and how the experience had changed them, and finally addressing the question of what would happen to the weapon now that Okonkwo was retiring and would no longer be actively monitoring it. The detective had already made arrangements, she explained, transferring responsibility for the safety deposit box to the priest who had helped seal the weapon, a man young enough that he could be expected to outlive both of them and maintain the secret for another generation. And she had also prepared a document explaining everything in detail, to be opened only in the event that the weapon needed to be used again. A guide for future monster hunters based on their experience and research. Okonkwo gave Maya a copy of this document, telling her to keep it somewhere safe and to pass it on to someone trustworthy before she died, ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost even as the people who had lived through the events aged and eventually passed away. Maya accepted the document with appropriate seriousness, understanding that she was now part of a legacy, a guardian of dangerous knowledge that must be preserved but also carefully controlled. And she promised Okonkwo that she would honor that responsibility, that she would never forget what they had done together or why it had mattered. They embraced when it was time to part, two people who had shared an experience that bound them more closely than family. And as Maya watched the detective walk away, she felt both sadness and gratitude, sad to be losing regular contact with one of the few people who truly understood her, but grateful to have had such a mentor and ally during the most difficult period of her life. College proved to be exactly what Maya needed, a fresh start in a place where no one knew her history, where she could be just another student rather than the girl marked by trauma, where she could explore new interests and form new relationships without the weight of her past constantly pressing down on her. She threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she had brought to investigating the creature, earning top grades in psychology and criminology courses. And she also joined several clubs and organizations, expanding her social circle and learning to trust people again after years of feeling isolated by her secret knowledge. She even found time to continue working on her novel, revising it based on feedback from writing workshops, and gradually improving both the craft and the emotional impact until it was something she felt genuinely proud of rather than just a therapeutic exercise. In her sophomore year, she finally found a literary agent willing to represent the book, a young woman who specialized in horror and thriller fiction, and who saw potential in Maya's unique voice and perspective. The agent shopped the manuscript to publishers, and within 6 months had secured a deal with a mid-sized press that specialized in psychological horror, offering an advance that was modest but meaningful and promising real promotional support for the book's release. Maya was thrilled, but also nervous about publication, worried about how readers would respond to a story that was based so closely on real events even if the details had been altered, worried also about whether publishing the book might somehow tempt fate, might draw the attention of other creatures if such things existed, might mark her as someone who knew too much about the supernatural world. She discussed these concerns with the agent, who assured her that fiction was just fiction, that readers would not assume any real-world basis unless Maya explicitly claimed there was one, and that plenty of horror authors wrote convincingly about monsters without actually having encountered them. This was true as far as it went, but Maya knew that her book contained details and insights that could only come from genuine experience, that perceptive readers might recognize the authenticity beneath the fictional veneer, and she had to accept that risk as the price of telling her story. The book was published during Maya's junior year of college under the title, The Crimson Smile, and it received generally positive reviews praising its psychological depth and genuinely frightening antagonist, with several critics noting that the monster felt more real and threatening than typical horror novel creatures, as if the author had somehow tapped into primal fears that most writers only approximated. The book sold moderately well, finding an audience among horror fans and young adult readers, and Maya did several promotional events including readings and signings where people asked her about her inspiration and her writing process, and whether she believed in the supernatural. She handled these questions carefully, giving vague answers about nightmares and imagination and research into folklore, never admitting the truth, but also never quite denying it, leaving just enough ambiguity to intrigue readers without exposing herself to ridicule or unwanted investigation. Among the readers who contacted her was a man named David Park, who claimed to have had an experience similar to what was described in her novel, who said that he had encountered something in the sewers of his hometown 20 years ago when he was a child. Something with a white face and a terrible smile that had killed his best friend before his eyes. And he wanted to know if Maya's book was based on a true story, because if it was, then he was not crazy. Then what he remembered was real and not a trauma-induced delusion, as his therapists had always insisted. Maya met with David via video call, both of them cautious and skeptical at first, but gradually opening up as they recognized genuine shared experience in each other's stories. And over several conversations, they compared notes about their respective encounters, finding disturbing similarities in the creature's appearance and behavior, in the way it had operated, and the cycles it seemed to follow, and the difficulty of getting anyone to believe that it was real. David had never fought his creature, had simply witnessed its attack and fled in terror, and he had lived with guilt and trauma for 2 decades, and hearing Maya's story of fighting back and winning gave him a sense of hope and validation that he had never felt before, finally allowing him to believe that his friend's death had not been meaningless, and that evil could be confronted and defeated even when it seemed impossible. Through David, Maya was introduced to a small online community of people who claimed to have encountered similar entities in various locations around the world, people who had been dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking by mainstream society, but who had found each other through internet forums and shared their stories in search of validation and understanding. Maya approached this community with healthy skepticism, recognizing that many of the accounts were likely fabrications or misidentifications or the products of mental illness. But among the noise, she found several testimonies that had the ring of truth, that contained specific details consistent with her own experience and with the research she had done into folklore and supernatural phenomena. She became an active but cautious participant in this community, sharing some of her knowledge while being careful not to reveal too much about the weapon or how the creature could be permanently stopped, reasoning that such information in the wrong hands could be dangerous, but offering general advice about protection and investigation and the importance of documentation and believing one's own experiences even when others were dismissive. This work gave Maya a sense of purpose beyond her academic studies, a feeling that she was contributing to a larger effort to understand and combat evil in its various forms, and it also connected her with people who shared her unique perspective on reality. People who understood what it meant to have seen behind the curtain and to carry knowledge that could not be easily shared or explained. As she progressed through college and then graduated with honors, Maya had to make decisions about her future career, and she found herself torn between the conventional path of graduate school and professional psychology practice versus the unconventional path of dedicated investigation into supernatural phenomena. The sensible choice was obviously the former, offering stability and respect and the ability to help people in recognized and accepted ways. But Maya could not quite let go of the feeling that she had been given her experience for a reason, that having fought a monster, and one made her uniquely qualified to help others in similar situations, that she had a responsibility to use her knowledge and skills for more than just academic achievement or professional success. She discussed this dilemma with several mentors, including one of her psychology professors, who surprised her by taking the question seriously rather than dismissing it as fantasy or delusion. The professor pointed out that many traditional societies had roles for people who dealt with spiritual or supernatural threats, shamans and exorcists, and witch doctors who served important functions even in cultures that also had conventional medicine and law enforcement, and that modern Western society had perhaps lost something by completely dismissing such roles as superstition and charlatanism. The professor suggested that Maya might be able to bridge both worlds, establishing herself as a legitimate professional while also quietly helping people who encountered inexplicable phenomena, using her psychological training to distinguish genuine supernatural experiences from mental illness, while also being willing to take action when the former was clearly operating. This advice resonated with Maya, offering a path that did not require her to choose between reason and experience, between the normal world and the hidden one, and she began to plan a career that could accommodate both aspects of her calling, applying to graduate programs while also networking with the online community and building a reputation as someone who could be consulted about unusual cases. She completed her master's degree in clinical psychology and began working as a therapist specializing in trauma, particularly trauma related to unexplained experiences and phenomena that mainstream psychology did not adequately address. And she quickly built a practice of clients who had encountered things they could not explain and who needed someone who would believe them rather than immediately pathologizing their experiences. Some of these cases were clearly psychological in origin, trauma, or stress or neurological issue. Creating experiences that felt real but were actually internal, and Maya treated these clients with appropriate therapeutic techniques while gently helping them distinguish between internal and external reality. But other cases were different, containing elements that Maya recognized from her own experience, descriptions of entities that matched patterns she had researched, situations that suggested genuine supernatural phenomena rather than psychological disturbance. And in these cases, Maya provided different kinds of help, offering protection strategies and investigation advice, and occasionally even direct intervention when the situation warranted it. Over the years, she developed a network of colleagues and contacts, people with various kinds of expertise, who could be called upon when dealing with unusual cases. from priests trained in exorcism to engineers who understood building layouts to hackers who could access restricted databases to folklorists who knew ancient stories about monster fighting techniques. Together they formed an informal organization dedicated to investigating and combating supernatural threats, operating completely outside official channels, but providing genuine help to people who had nowhere else to turn. Maya thought of them as a modern version of the monster hunters from folklore, ordinary people with various skills who had recognized that evil existed in forms beyond human malice, and who had chosen to act rather than ignore or deny what they had seen. The work was often dangerous and always exhausting, taking Maya into situations that reminded her of her teenage encounter in the Millbrook Falls sewers, but it also felt deeply meaningful, each successful intervention saving lives and preventing suffering in ways that conventional therapy alone could never accomplish. She maintained contact with Detective Okonkwo throughout these years, the retired officer following Maya's career with pride and satisfaction, pleased that the girl she had mentored had found a way to channel her traumatic experience into positive action, that Maya had not been broken by what they had experienced together, but had instead been forged into someone stronger and more capable. They still met occasionally for coffee when Maya visited her hometown, 2 generations of monster hunters comparing notes and sharing stories, and Okonkwo sometimes consulted on cases that had law enforcement dimensions, using her experience and connections to help Maya navigate official systems and bureaucracies. The detective lived long enough to see Maya's second book published, a nonfiction work disguised as folklore study that actually contained practical information about identifying and combating various types of supernatural entities, written carefully enough that skeptical readers would see it as interesting cultural research, while informed readers would recognize it as a genuine guide. And Okonkwo told Maya that she was proud of her, that she had taken the K. Knowledge they had gained together and expanded it and shared it in ways that would help countless people, that she had become exactly the kind of person the world needed, even if the world did not fully appreciate or understand what she was doing. When Detective Sarah Okonkwo died peacefully in her sleep at age 78, Maya spoke at her funeral about courage and integrity, and the importance of believing in things that others dismissed, speaking carefully to avoid revealing secrets, but making it clear that Okonkwo had been a true hero who had saved lives in ways that would never be officially recognized or publicly acknowledged. And many people in attendance who knew nothing of the detective's secret work were moved by the eulogy, sensing that there was more to Okonkwo's story than the conventional narrative of a dedicated career officer. Maya inherited certain items from Okonkwo's estate, including files and research materials related to the Millbrook Falls case, and to other investigations the detective had quietly pursued over the years, evidence that Okonkwo had never stopped looking for monsters even after retirement, that she had maintained her vigilance until the very end. And Maya added these materials to her own growing archive of supernatural case files, a library of knowledge that she hoped would someday be properly organized and preserved for future generations of investigators. The years passed and Maya entered middle age, her practice well established, her books continuing to sell, her reputation growing among those who knew about the hidden world of supernatural threats. But she never forgot her first case, never forgot the creature with the crimson smile that had nearly taken her brother, and that she had trapped in an enchanted weapon that still rested in a safety deposit box in a bank vault. She checked on the weapon periodically, visiting the bank every few years to verify that the box remained sealed and undisturbed, that the priest Okonkwo had entrusted with its care was still maintaining the protections and wards that kept the trapped entity from escaping. And each time she confirmed that the weapon was secure, she felt both relief and a nagging worry that 27 years was approaching again. That if the cycle was somehow independent of the physical creature then new, disappearances might begin in Millbrook Falls despite her actions all those years ago. When Maya was 41 years old, exactly 27 years after her confrontation with the creature, she received a phone call from the current police chief of Millbrook Falls, a woman named Jennifer Reeves, who had been a rookie officer during the Shrine investigation and who remembered Maya as the teenager who had somehow been involved in the case even though the official reports were vague about her role. Chief Reeves told Maya that a child had disappeared in Millbrook Falls, a 7-year-old boy named Ethan Lee last seen playing near a storm drain in the old downtown area. And while there was no evidence of foul play, and the boy might simply be lost or have run away, Reeves remembered the pattern from 27 years ago and wanted to consult with Maya about the possibility that something was happening again, that history might be repeating despite the shrine discovery and all the supposed closure that had brought. Maya felt ice forming in her chest as she listened to this news, all her worst fears apparently confirmed, the cycle resuming right on schedule, as if nothing they had done mattered, as if the creature trapped in the weapon had somehow projected itself or created a successor or had never truly been alone in the first place. She promised Chief Reeves she would come to Millbrook Falls immediately, canceling her appointments and packing a bag and making the drive from her home to her childhood town within hours of receiving the call. She went first to the bank to check on the weapon, her hands shaking as she signed the paperwork, and was escorted to the vault. As she opened the safety deposit box and looked inside to confirm her deepest fear, the weapon was gone, the box empty except for a layer of rust-red dust that might have been dried blood or might have been the remains of whatever seals had been placed on the blade. Evidence that someone had opened the box and removed the weapon and possibly released the creature it contained. Maya stood in the bank vault feeling the weight of failure crushing down on her, understanding that all her precautions had been insufficient, that the weapon had been found and opened, and now the creature was free again to resume its cycle of hunting and feeding. And it was her fault for not finding a better way to secure or destroy the weapon. Her fault for assuming that a simple safety deposit box would be adequate protection against an entity that had survived for over a century and knew how to manipulate humans into doing its bidding. She contacted the priest immediately only to learn that he had died 3 months earlier in a car accident, and with his death the knowledge of the weapon's location and importance had apparently been lost, the safety deposit box becoming just another unclaimed asset to be eventually opened and processed according to bank policies, its contents cataloged and possibly sold off or discarded without anyone understanding the danger. Maya wanted to scream at the cosmic unfairness of it, the bad luck or malicious fate that had killed the one person who understood the importance of keeping the weapon sealed. But she forced herself to focus on the immediate crisis, on finding the missing boy, and stopping the creature before it could claim more victims. She met with Chief Reeves at the police station and shared more information than she had shared 27 years ago, finding that the chief was more willing to consider unconventional explanations than her predecessors had been, perhaps because Reeves had been present during the Shrine investigation and had seen evidence that did not fit comfortably into normal frameworks of understanding. Together they reviewed what was known about Ethan Lee's disappearance, the timeline and location and witness statements, and Maya saw immediately that it matched the pattern of previous disappearances. The boy last seen near a storm drain marked with a red balloon, playing alone in an area that should have been safe, but that gave the creature access from below. They had hours at most before the boy would be taken too deep into the tunnel system to rescue, assuming he was still alive. And Maya knew that going down into those tunnels again was the only option despite her fear, despite the fact that she was 27 years older and less physically capable than she had been as a teenager. Despite having no weapon and no real plan except desperation and the faint hope that her previous experience might give her some advantage. She recruited help from the online community she had built over the years, putting out urgent calls for anyone within driving distance who had experience with supernatural entities, and she was surprised by how many people responded, arriving in Millbrook Falls over the next few hours. A motley group of monster hunters and paranormal investigators, and people who had survived their own encounters with darkness, and who wanted to prevent others from experiencing the same trauma. They organized quickly with Maya as their leader, a woman in her 40s, who carried the authority of experience and survival, and together they descended into the sewers through multiple access points, forming search teams and carrying weapons that ranged from iron and silver to blessed water to modern firearms loaded with ammunition that had been prepared according to various folklore traditions. The tunnels were as dark and terrible as Maya remembered, unchanged by the passage of time, and as they penetrated deeper into the system following leads and instinct, and the faint sounds that might have been a child crying or might have been something pretending to be a child crying, Maya felt the years falling away, felt herself becoming again the terrified but determined teenager who had first ventured into this darkness to save her brother. They found the shrine room rebuilt, fresh objects and photographs replacing those that had been removed by the police investigation, evidence that the creature had indeed returned and resumed its activities. And among the new additions, Maya saw a photograph of Ethan Lee, smiling and unaware,